Hi everyone, just before we get this next history hack out and going, just a quick reminder that there are lots of ways you can support the pod. Remember, just by liking, subscribing and sharing it with your friends, that is invaluable as it gets the word out and our witterings can go far and wide. But if you're able to support us financially, that would be incredible because it helps us keep doing what we're doing. In the description to this episode, there are links to Patreon, where you can support the podcast regularly, and Ko-Fi, where you can tip us for an episode that you like. But we've also got some merch. So if you head to shop.historyhackpod.com, you'll be able to see some incredible bits of merchandise featuring the incredible designs that Steve Smith does for every episode. We've got some totes on there, some mugs, and we got more stuff coming all the time. So please do check that out. And if you are able to support us financially, that is incredible. Thank you so much. But even if it's just liking, sharing, and telling everyone we're incredible, that helps us too. So without further ado, hello and welcome to History Hacks, dedicated Second World War-ish air power podcast, Hedge-Hopping with me, Matt Bone. We've got a fantastic episode as always, and an even more fantastic guest who's going to tell us an incredible story today. Because of all the images of Typhoons I've looked at, and there have been many, one has always stood out to me. It's the image of a pilot in the cockpit of a fighter recon Typhoon, and that pilot smiling at the camera with the most infectious smile you've ever seen. That pilot was the then squadron leader Karun Jumbo Majumdar, Jumbo to his friends. If you're listening to this episode on the day of release, the 17th of February, it is the 77th anniversary of the hurricane accident in which he was killed. Jumbo's life and career with the pre-war Indian Air Force is one I've always been keen to explore, and I'm really excited because we've got Jagan Pillarisetti with us today to discuss it. Now, I asked him for a bit of a bio, so this is going to take a bit because the man knows his stuff. A self-confessed aviation nerd with a specific interest in Indian aviation history and the early days of the Indian Air Force and the RAF in India. Jagan authored 3 books, including one on the Westland Mapiti aircraft, which was the mainstay of the IAF and the RAF in India in the 30s. He's an honorary fellow of the erstwhile Center for Armed Forces Historical Research in India, and a member of Air Britain, the organization for aviation enthusiasts. Amazingly, he's still got time to run 2 websites devoted to Indian aviation: Rakshack.com, which has a significant section devoted to the IAF, and warbirds.in, which is devoted to vintage aircraft in India. And there's another website, which is the phenomenal rafcommands.com, which is a resource I dive into all the time. So all the intros are done. We can finally speak to him. Jagan, thank you so much for joining. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thank you for having me on your podcast. And you have selected a subject that is dear to many of the, I would say almost all Indian aviation historians, which is Jumbo Majumdar. So I'm delighted to be here to discuss more in depth about this marvelous gentleman. Who sort of set an ideal for many Indians during the World War II. And a lot is known, but again, there is still a lot more to explore. So I am delighted to be here to have this discussion with you to talk about this legend.
Legend's the right word. I'm really excited because, like we were chatting before, I know the highlights, but I really want to sort of, with your help, explore this remarkable man's life, because it takes in more than just the Second World War. And I think it's important to understand really the birth of the Indian Air Force and the Indians that were joining it at the time. So let's get cracking, really. And let's start with the IAF. So what were the origins of the IAF?
So the IAF, as you know, the Indian Air Force, right from the 1800s till the early 1900s, the British government operated a military force within the Indian subcontinent. And they had a fairly large Indian army, which was made up completely of volunteers recruited from different areas of the country. And they contributed significantly to the First World War effort on the behalf of the Allies. And at that time of the First World War, Indians were not eligible to hold commissions within the Indian Army that the India office had set up at that time. They could only hold positions what we call Viceroy commissioned officers, which are not really the equivalent of a King's Commissioned officer role either. So at the end of the First World War, looking at the contributions that Indian volunteers had made towards the Allied victory, there was a popular demand among the Indian subjects of the empire that the commissioned roles should be opened up for Indians as well. So it started with the proposal that Indians should have, should be commissioned as officers equivalent to their British counterparts within the Indian Army. From there, the what they call it, the Indianization movement spread to the other branches. One of them was, just as you had officers in the Indian Army, there should be an equivalent Indian Air Force, just like the RAF was operating in India at that time. The RAF first presence was in the early 1920s. They had been usually doing air policing and community policing from the air, especially in the northwest frontier area, throughout the 20s, and publicity displays throughout the country along the way. So the demand came that just like the British had maintained different forces, there should be proper representation of Indians within the subcontinent as well. So as part of that, there was a Skene committee that was established in the late 1920s. And what the Skene committee recommended was that the Royal Air Force recruit Indians as officers and as pilots to fly aircraft with the RAF. Now, here's the question. If somebody joins the RAF, they cannot demand and say, hey, I want to serve only within India. If you're joining the RAF, you are signing up to serve throughout the world. And what the British wanted was, okay, this demand will come up. We cannot take Indians out of India and ask them to fight wars overseas. So let's come up with a separate Indian Air Force that is limited to the defense of India. And we'll hire Indians only for that specific force. That's how the idea of the Indian Air Force was born. Now, there's another side to it. By creating an Indian Air Force and having Indians limited only to that specific Indian Air Force, you avoid a situation where an Indian may rise to a senior position and start exercising powers of punishment over a British subject. That's a big no-no in the subcontinent. You can't have a common, public, a villager sees a British subject being ordered around by an Indian officer. That's very damaging to the prestige of the British government. So they kept the forces clearly distinguished and separate. That's why the Special Indian Air Force Act was formed. And that Indian Air Force Act allowed Indian officers and airmen to be recruited and trained. And to train them, RAF officers would be deputed from the RAF to provide training, leadership, mentor them, etc.
So it's progressive and still repressive all at the same time.
Exactly. And I don't know if maybe I'm overstepping beyond the scope of our subject, but it was only around 1942 or 43 where somebody woke up in Britain and said, hey, these guys are fighting the war, shoulder to shoulder with us. Maybe we should give them, some sort of powers of punishment on British airmen under their command. So there were a lot of correspondence between the India office and the Air Ministry saying, okay, we'll let them exercise command over British ranks. One funny thing is, in the early days, every Indian Air Force squadron had a British adjutant.
Really?
And the reason for a British adjutant is the British adjutant had the powers of punishment and discipline over the British airmen deputed to the IAF squadron. So, as you said, it was 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, but still progress nevertheless. Now, what has happened is so the Skene Committee submitted the recommendations in the late 1920s, and starting 1931, Indians became eligible to apply for many of the British military training institutions. So there was a national level entrance exam where young Indians fresh out of college would write this competitive exam and get selected. They had the options of picking Sandhurst or Cranwell or Woolwich. And at that time, the prestige was always with the Indian Army. So Sandhurst and Woolwich were quite popular, and Cranwell was a new thing. Not many people opted for it because apart from the very first batch, which had like 6 officers choose Cranwell, Subsequent yearly exams failed to generate that amount of interest among people who applied for Cranwell. So the first batch, I believe, came to RAF Cranwell in 1931. That was 5 pilots, and one officer was found to be too short. He was sent to the equipment branch. And Jumbo was in the third batch, meaning in these exams were conducted every 6 months. So he was in the third tranche of officers that passed this particular exam and got selected and came to the UK for training. So that's pretty much how the Indian Air Force was established and how the training intake was established to build up this nucleus of the force.
We're going to start sort of jumping back and forth here in a minute, but how big are we talking about the Indian Air Force being sort of late 30s in the lead up to war?
The right word to use is it was a very tiny force. In fact, the British had about 4 to 5 squadrons stationed in India, and at a very minimum, they had 3 squadrons operating Army cooperation aircraft. The original plan was to equip a squadron unit at least 20 officers, 20 pilots, and a significant chunk of airmen as well. But the intake was so slow and so minimal that it took them nearly 8 years to build up to a squadron strength. So the Indian Air Force, when it was started, the first squadron number 1 squadron was raised on 1st April 1933. It was just one flight of 4 Wapiti aircraft. And it was just one flight with one British squadron leader, a British flying officer Broad as his adjutant, and these 5 pilots who graduated out of Cranwell. So it added a second flight after a couple of years and a third flight after another. It was only towards 1938 or so. It had like 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. Till the outbreak of the Second World War, there was only one unit, that is number 1 squadron. There were literally no pilots, Indians who were successfully went through Cranwell to equip more than 1 squadron. But the outbreak of the Second World War sort of accelerated the process. It led to the establishment of the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve, where they were able to take Indians who had already held civil private pilot certificates, who gave them commissions straight away and started taking them to serve in the Second World War. So that started beefing up the strength of the Air Force, and they raised the number 2 squadron was only raised in 1941. And subsequently, it grew up to a force of about 10 squadrons by the end of World War II. So compared to what the RAF was, the Indian Air Force was quite small. It's a very small force of 10 squadrons operating aircraft. But it wasn't just the aircraft component. We are also talking about the logistics. A whole bunch of airmen joined up to provide support to the various RAF maintenance units on the ground, forward bases, airfield construction battalions. So the contribution was much more than just the folks who flew the fighter aircraft, which was limited to 10. And if you look at it, the RAF had about 100,000 airmen in 1945. In addition to that 100,000, the Indian Air Force provided almost like 50 to 60,000 airmen to assess the Allied war effort. So that gives you a sort of an idea of what the AF was.
So it's that slow build up and then explosion as most of these forces did. And we're going to get you back to talk about what happens post-war. And that's another episode, because that's equally fascinating, because we get to talk about tempests and things like that then. But let's get on to Jumbo himself. So where was he from? Who were his people? What was his early life like?
So Jumbo is essentially from an area of India at that time, the combined subcontinent of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. He was from an area which would have been called Bengal. Today, that area is now the Indian state of West Bengal and the country of Bangladesh. So he was essentially from a Bengali family, a very distinguished Bengali family. He was born Karun Krishna Majumdar. He was born in Kolkata today. His father was Captain P.K. Majumdar. He was called Priyo Majumdar. Her mother was Janki. He was their second son. What is not really popularly known as Jumbo had one elder brother, Jai Krishna Majumdar, and he went by the nickname Shackles. And Shackles was older to Jumbo by, I believe, by about 2 years. And he also wrote the same entrance exam that Jumbo did. Jumbo opted for the Air Force, Shackles went to the Army. So he went to Sandhurst, he went to Cranwell. And how Jumbo got interested into aviation was that, all his education was in the Northeast, in the East, in Darjeeling area. He went to British schools. And at the same time, they also suffered through the ravages of that time. Both Jumbo and Shackles both were hit by typhoid at a very young age. They had to go through these health problems. But his father joined the Indian Army as an officer. That's why he was called Captain P.K. Majumdar. But he ensured that they were a well-off family. He ensured that they were taken care of, they recovered. And on one of the recovery vacations, Jumbo had got in touch with an RAF veteran. An RAF veteran was a friend of his cousin. And that's how that interest in the Air Force got initiated. That's where he learned about aviation, aircraft. And he knew the RAF had operated. And when the opportunity came, when he learned that Indians were being accepted into the IAF for flying training, and he spoke with the family and appeared for the entrance exam. Prior to that, I think his father had some background in the army, and of course his brother was also trying to join the army, and he became a KCIO. Another interesting fact was, I'll digress a little bit and speak about his elder brother Shackles. Even though he was an army officer, he was a cavalry officer. He came back to India, and he learned flying and became a civil certificate holder. So both the brothers were flyers. Only thing is, one was in the Air Force, the other was in the cavalry, but he held a civil certificate.
So Shackles went full posh. Not only did he join the army, go to Sandhurst, he went cavalry.
Yes, and then there's a tragedy behind the story of these two brothers. We'll touch upon that a little bit later.
Okay, so he's a young man. He takes the entrance exam. So that's 1931 we're at now, isn't it? So I guess the question really is, do we know much about his time at Cranwell? I would guess that's quite a culture shock, going from Kolkata to the Midlands.
Well, I did mention, right, that he came from a family which was decently well off. His father had sufficient assets to pay for and fund the expenses going to Cranwell. I mean, the parents had to still pay for all the expenses. I mean, they did have sponsors and etc., but the primary expenses still had to be paid by the parents. That means that the family had to be very well off and connected to start off with. His sister was already in the UK. So it wasn't much of a culture shock for Jumbo because he always had his sister to, go and live with her, with his sister and brother-in-law. And these people had sufficient interaction with the British community within India that I don't think it was much of a culture shock. The weather might have been, and it is written in a lot of other literature that these cadets were pretty much kept isolated in Cranwell, pretty much focused into their training, that they had very little exposure, and whatever little time they had, they would go visit their Indian contacts and friends and relatives where possible. In case of Jumbo, he was not the only Indian cadet. He was in a batch of 3. The other 2 were Narendra and Daljit Singh. Daljit Singh had to leave the Air Force within 2 years after coming back to India. So it was only Narendra and Jumbo who carried on for some time. And of course, Narendra served till up to 1951 when he died in another air crash. And when these 3 cadets came, there were already 5 from the senior batch and another one from the second batch training. So there were about 10 Indian cadets training at Cranwell. So there was sufficient presence there for him to get used to it. And Cranwell, they followed the exact same training pattern that the RAF entrance did. I mean, whatever, the way they were given instructors, the aircraft that they trained in was exactly how the RAF trainees were provided as well. It was a 2-year syllabus, and at the end of 2 years, they were sent to old Saram for Army Cooperation training, because at that time, most of the aircraft were Army Cooperation types. And the Westland Wapiti was a mainstay which these folks trained on.
So just in case people aren't aware, what was Army Cooperation?
So our Army Cooperation is essentially assist the land forces in their operations. So in the context of India, most of the Army Cooperation sorties were flown in the Northwest Frontier Province, where the British were in a perennial fight with the tribesmen of the Northwest Frontier Province, which was going on till recently with the Americans as well, as you know. And it was just keeping the belligerent tribes of the Northwest frontier at play, policing them through the air, policing them through by sending army columns on the ground. What would happen is when the Indian Army would send expeditions out, or along with the British regiments, they would get attacked, they would get ambushed by the tribesmen. The aircraft were responsible by going ahead, doing recce, finding out if there were ambushes, and they had to communicate with all the moving columns. And this communication was essentially done by light signals, through cloth panels on the ground, by picking up messages through hooks. That is all what Army cooperation was. It was working very closely with your Army counterparts, communicating with them. They didn't have radios. They didn't have radios like we have today, or even during the Second World War. It was all signals and cloth signals, flags, and messages being picked up by low-flying aircraft. Once in a while, if a particular post, far-out post, got into trouble, the RAF was called to provide suppressive firepower, and that would be done by dropping small bombs and by firing the front and the rear guns. There was always a rear gunner with a Lewis gun sitting in the back. They would provide that supporting firepower against the tribesmen. There's one aspect of it which people may not like today. It is what is called the proscription rates. If a particular tribe is too belligerent, become too much of a nuisance, you try to punish them by going and setting fire to their villages. So if you wanted to punish a particular tribe or a particular section, the RAF would fly aircraft. They would do it in a gentlemanly way. They would drop pamphlets saying, "Hey, get out of this village. We're coming at so-and-so time to burn your village down." But that happened. So that was also part of Army cooperation. What we today call proscription sorties.
It's a very specific use of force, isn't it? Especially in the Northwest frontier. That I can remember reading it was one of the reasons the RAF pitched so much for it. It was a cheap way of showing how they could project force and keep themselves going during times of peace.
Yep, exactly. And I believe the budget for operating the RAF in India used to come from the India office. The India office used to pay for the expense of operating this aircraft, and that's what you need to police the empire. Keep the natives at bay. So that as you're right, it is an effective, cost-effective way of securing the frontier.
What were they flying at this point?
So by the time Jumbo came back, the primary aircraft was a Westland Wapiti. Mm-hmm. Then the Westland Wapiti was, I think it entered service in the Indian subcontinent in around 1931. And when the IF squadron was stood up in 1933, at that time, there were three RAF squadrons and the IF squadron that was coming up. That was the primary aircraft. It wasn't until 1936 or so you had a slightly modern aircraft like the Hawker RX and the Hawker Hart that came into the picture. But the Wapiti was the mainstay for the entire 1930s for the RAF units.
So we're talking about big, rugged biplanes, basically.
The Wapiti was a giant of an aircraft. I mean, if you compare it with the Gloucester Gladiator or the Hawker Hart, the Wapiti was quite huge. I had the privilege of speaking to a couple of World War II veterans who had flown the Wapiti, and one of them said it's also a very easy aircraft to fly. You take off at 100 miles per hour, you fly it at 100 miles per hour, you land it at 100 miles.
That's brilliant. So everything changes in 1939, and it's quite a year for Jumbo, isn't it? Because it's not just outbreak of war for him. He's got big personal things going on as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, and by 1939, as the war clouds are brewing, he's an officer with about 4 or 5 years of service. As with young men who are eligible bachelors, his family wanted him to get married, and in India it's always the arranged marriage concept. So his parents identified an educated girl and introduced him to her, and so in just about a month after World War II breaks out in Europe, Jumbo had to go to his own marriage. He married Pramola Das, and that happened in November 1939. So and the war breaks out, and you have to now start a family. So I would say, that was probably a quite busy time for Jumbo. And What was also happening is by now he has picked up his rank. He's become a flying officer. He's on path to become a flight lieutenant. And almost as soon as on same date that the war broke out, the number one squadron, Indian Air Force, became the first unit to be commanded by an Indian. Till that point in time, there were British officers who were the COs, and Indians were still junior. They were flight commanders, they were adjutants, they were younger pilots, but no one actually took over command. So just the month before, Jumbo's senior, Subrata Mukherjee, he became the first Indian commanding officer of number one squadron. So that was a milestone. So it was a quite hectic time for the unit at that time. And I mentioned that because Jumbo would follow Subrata as the second Indian commanding officer of the squadron. So even though he had like 4 to 5 other senior officers, he was at the right place at the right time to take over command when the first CO was sort of graduated out of the seniority and went away. So he had the distinction of being the second CO, Indian CO of the unit.
So he's a respected, experienced officer. So it's not just the case of him being in the right place, but he's a marked man on his way up, really.
He is, and to be fair, because of the selection process that was put in place, almost everyone who trained at Cranwell and came to the squadron had that kind of a reputation. I mean, these guys were like real professionals. They flew extensively in the Northwest Frontier Province. Into the years leading up to the World War II, some flights would be detached to the Northwest Frontier Province and they would be attached to an RAF squadron. They would operate as part of an extra flight of the RAF squadron, gain the experience required for operations. So in that context, almost everyone who came out of Cranwell carried that kind of experience. But Jumbo was an impressive character. This guy was like 6 foot tall. If you look up photographs, he's not a diminutive person. He and his brother were both giants. And that actually goes against the impression that some folks may have about people from Kolkata. They'll assume them to be short, but these guys are really tall. So they're very impressive personalities, and they were looked at as born leaders. There's no two ways about it.
So what's happening in India? So we've got, realistically, to my uneducated mind, 2 years of not a lot happening until the Japanese decide to make their move. I'm assuming that's incorrect because that's just a very sort of stereotypical bit of knowledge I need to have cleared up.
Yeah, so what was happening is, of course, the war was primarily focused in Europe. There was a freedom movement going on within India where Indians wanted self-governance. They want to be their own rulers, in the sense, set up their own government, and that freedom movement was going on. So there was a conflict that many of these officers went through. Like in a way, they were representing India, but at the same time, they are also serving an alien protocol ruling force. Meaning, so I'm fairly sure that people like Jumbo and their counterparts, they went through this a lot of soul searching and self-conflict as to what exactly their role was. But a lot of times, the leaders who were leading the freedom movement had communications with the officers by telling them, saying, we do not want you to get involved in politics into the freedom movement. When the British do give us independence, you would need experienced people to run the armed forces. You would need experienced people to run the government. So there were some communication going on from the leaders to the officers, and so a lot of these officers decided that their role was to be part of the Indian Army or the Indian Air Force, the armed forces, and learn whatever they can and take part in the war. Now, even though there was no war happening in the environs of the Indian subcontinent, the India office did start sending Indian troops over to North Africa. They took part in the Eritrean campaign and the African campaign. So that was going on. And at the same time, because the Indian Air Force was expanding, they did send as a token contribution, they did send about 24 pilots to UK in 1940 to take part in the Battle of Britain. They arrived too late to take part in the Battle of Britain. They were rookie pilots. By the time they took training, the rubabs were going on in 1941 over Europe. So that token contribution was sent over there, but a bulk of the Indian Air Force, people who were training, etc., were still, operating in the Northwest Frontier Province. till the war cloud started rumbling towards end of December. And that's when, all hell breaks loose, as we'll talk about what happened next.
There's the most succinct way of putting it, all hell breaking loose, because it's a flood, isn't it? This race south the Japanese go on. What is the sort of reaction in India, and how does the IAF move into the positions to try to assist the army as best they can?
So when the war breaks out in the Far East, there were only 3 squadrons that have been raised at that point. 2 of them were number 1, number 2, number 3. Number 2 and number 3 squadrons were still new. One was the only one that was quite senior. So somewhere around July 1941, the British imported about 100 Westland Lysander aircraft from Africa to India. And these are not new aircraft. These are beaten up aircraft disposed of from the North African theater that has seen the the dust storms of Sahara. Those are the aircraft that were brought to India. And you wouldn't believe it, those are the most modern aircraft that were present in the Indian subcontinent.
So they've got some well-worn Lysanders, but it's still a step up from the...
It is still, they did have a few Bristol Blenheim bombers, but in terms of single-engined aircraft, the Lysanders were the most modern aircraft that were there in the subcontinent at that time. And the first 2 units that re-equipped with the Lysander were number 28 Squadron RAF and number 1 Squadron Indian Air Force. And both of them used to be co-located in the Northwest Frontier Province. And when the front was heating up in December 1941, the British started, the RAF started moving all the squadrons to the Burma front. And both 1 and 28 were earmarked to move to Burma. In fact, Burma had better equipment than some of the RAF units in Burma had better equipment than the RAF units in India. We had 67 Squadron flying Brewster Buffaloes, which was fairly modern, fairly powerful, though not a match against the Zero and against the Japanese aircraft. But all that the RAF could muster were these Lysanders. Somewhere in the middle of January, where the modern aircraft like the Hurricanes, etc., were started being ferried from the Middle East. They would be over Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, and they would finally arrive in Karachi and be flown all across the subcontinent. And they formed some of the fighter force towards the beginning of February. And that's how the force was built up. As far as Majumdar is concerned, he was given orders to move his squadron to the Burma front, and that happened towards the last week of January, where they flew from the northwest all the way to Burma.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to History Hacks Hedge-Hopping. And this is where the sort of daring do begins, really, isn't it? Because they start having to make, I don't want to say make do and mend, because it's not really that, but they are making the Lysander do a lot of things the Lysander wasn't intended to do.
Yes.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it shows the sort of tactical flexibility that they have to make the most of what they've got.
The Lysander was an army cooperation aircraft. It was not a combat aircraft. It was not supposed to undertake offensive operations. As soon as both the squadrons, both 28 RAF and 1 IAF arrived at Tonga in Burma, on the very first night, that airfield was attacked by the Japanese. And it was, the credit is normally given to Jumbo, because even though you had an RAF unit and an IAF unit, the RAF unit was fully engrossed in doing army cooperation duties, ferrying senior officers, carrying signals, carrying recce missions. But Jumbo sort of stepped out of, his allotted roles and said, we were attacked by the Japanese. Based on intelligence, we know where the aircraft came from. So he took the decision to equip the Lysander with, arm the Lysander with bombs. And he planned a single aircraft bombing mission against a Japanese airfield that was believed to exist in Mehong Song. Now he was escorted by 2 of the Buffaloes belonging to 67 Squadron. I mean, I would love to know how that idea came about, who approved it. There must have been some discussion that happened that we don't know. But what we know for sure is there was a single aircraft bombing mission that Jumbo flew alone, and he was escorted by 2 Kiwis in their buffaloes. And he located the airfield, dropped the 2 bombs, and safely came back. In terms of blunting the Japanese effort, it was probably nothing, but it was great for the morale of whoever was there at Tonga. And once that was done, the floodgates opened. So now everybody flying a Lysander wanted to take part in offensive ops. That became the model for the Lysander operations, whether it was 1 or 28 squadron, to carry bombs and carry out offensive missions, over the subsequent weeks. So both the squadrons did a lot of offensive operations against small marine docks, Sitang River, Japanese positions at the Sitang Bridge, things like that. And the RAF had to throw in every aircraft that they had. If anything could carry a bullet or a bomb, they were open to using it. And that's how the Lysanders pretty much went into an offensive role during that period. And it's exactly 80 years as we sit here and keep talking. Exactly 80 years ago, February 1942, where these guys were flying these missions against the Japanese.
Did they have to fall back very much from the advance? I would guess they'd be quite forward from an Army cooperation base.
So they sort of split up the force. One went to Lashio. One force was at Mingaladon, which is in Rangoon. But as the Japanese started advancing, the assets were pulled back. So one of the first things that happened was the airmen, all the ground staff were sent by ship from Rangoon to Calcutta by ship. And all the aircraft were slowly flown back to Akyab and further back. The operation sort of winded down in the first week of March, and the entire number 1 squadron sort of made their way back to the Indian subcontinent in bits and pieces. Jumbo and a couple of his senior officers himself, they left their Lysanders to the Burma Volunteer Air Force, and they were flown back in one of the US Air Force B-17s that just about arrived in Burma at that time.
It's a remarkable few months worth of combat operations, high stress, and he's awarded his first DFC for it.
Yes, and because of his contributions in the months of February and March, Jumbo was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and that was the first DFC awarded to an Indian on the Burma front. He and another officer, Aspy engineer, both were awarded DFC at the same time. Aspy was awarded for operations in the Northwest Frontier, but Jumbo's was the first DFC awarded for the Burma front. And the only one that was given to number 1 squadron, and it would be at least 3 years before subsequent DFCs were given to officers of the AF. So that way, that's when Jumbo's name becomes a household name across India. As the first officer to be decorated for the Burma front by the RAF, the DFC, and he becomes quite a popular figure, followed by everybody. And that sort of also cuts down his options. Once you have commanded the only squadron, the senior most squadron, where do you go? You got to go to a staff job. You got to go to air headquarters someplace. So that sort of also cuts down what he could do over the subsequent years. We'll talk about that.
We might not know the answer to this one, and it's not on my list of questions for you. How did he get the nickname Jumbo? Is it because he was a big chap? And by that, we mean tall as opposed to large, like my good
That's
son.
a good question, but I think the nickname was given by his family. I don't know how his elder brother got the nickname Shackles. I think Shackles and Jumbo were something that the family came up with, and that stuck with them. But that's a very good question.
So it wasn't an unfortunate name that a lot of RAF pilots gave to pilots from elsewhere in the world. I can think of a few of the West Indian pilots who had some.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think this was. I mean, he had this name prior to joining the Air Force. And of course he carried that as his call sign going into the Air Force.
So he's done about as much as he can do by, I guess, middle of 1942. What's his decision path then? Because he said he could go to fly a desk, quite straightforward, get out of the action. What's his decisions after that?
So what actually happened is when the squadron came back from the Burma front, number 1 squadron was re-equipped with the Hawker Hurricane. So all the pilots were sent to Peshawar to train with the OTU, fighter OTU on the Hurricane. Now, Jumbo was fairly senior at that time. If you look at the seniority, he was probably the fourth or the 5th senior most officer with the IAF at that time. And naturally, more and more officers were coming up to assume commands of the squadron. So he had to go to another posting. And the Indian Air Force was not so big that it had wings. It was operating with multiple wings or anything like that. So ultimately, what happened is Jumbo was sent to Air Headquarters in Delhi, and he spent some time with the Directorate of Recruiting because he was a popular figure. They wanted to use him as a role model. Then he was given the role of staffing the Inspectorate General Directorate. I don't know if that was the right time, but the Inspectorate General department would go to different units within the subcontinent and assess the sort of audit the unit, how they are in terms of training standards, etc. So this Inspectorate General Office was formed only for the AF. So only the AF units were sort of assessed, and Jumbo was one of the assessing officers. He would go to individual units, see their readiness, validate their training. So it was pretty much a dust job. And he was there for a couple of years. And during this time, his family also grew. I mentioned he got married in early 1939. So they were blessed with a couple of children, a daughter and a son. So sometime around 1940, end of 1943, Jumbo got restless. By that time, he was a wing commander, a Cranwell graduate wing commander. You are literally not going to get back into flying fighters on the front line ever again. You'll probably become a station commander, commanding an air base, or a bomber wing, but India was too small to have any kind of large bomber or fighter wings, at least in the Indian Air Force. So his options were limited in terms of combat or flying. So towards the end of 1943, he got restless, and he essentially asked his superiors, saying that he wanted to go fly in the European theater. By that time, the European theater was quite full of action. And if you compare the action that was happening in India was probably 5 to 10% of what was happening in Europe in terms of the sorties, in terms of the aircraft involved, casualties. So India was still a safer posting, but Jumbo really wanted to fly in the European theater and just not sit on his behind in some dust job in New Delhi and spend the rest of the war there. So for that, he was a wing commander. He was an acting wing commander. So the air headquarters, again, staffed by senior RAF officers, they respected what Jumbo asked for and did, and they came up with a plan to send him to Europe. And that's how you find Jumbo in the United Kingdom, somewhere in around March or April, getting trained on the latest high-performance fighters that are being flown in the European theater.
And he goes into, this might surprise people, but the arm of flying in Northwest Europe I find most fascinating, which is tactical reconnaissance.
Tactical reconnaissance. Now, there's a story behind that too. So,
okay.
And the surprising thing is, for such a senior officer as Jumbo, he had never flown a Hawker Hurricane or a Spitfire till 1944.
Really?
Yes, because
he thought he would have pulled rank on that and going, I'm having a go in that.
Yeah. So once he was flying the Lysander, and once he came back, before the squadron equipped to the Hawker Hurricane, he was posted to a desk job. So he never had the opportunity to convert to a Hurricane and fly one of the faster monoplane fighters. So he may have got some exposure here and there, but operationally he never trained. He was never operationally declared as operational on these high performance fighters of the European theater till about April 1944, when he arrived in UK and went to one of the fighter rotations. That's where he flew Hurricanes first, then he flew Mustangs. And the reason he was sent to a tactical reconnaissance squadron was that you would have heard about 268 Squadron, which was a specialist squadron for carrying out these recce missions. The CEO of that squadron was Squadron Leader A.S. Mann. And A.S. Mann was the flight commander of 28 Squadron in Burma when Jumbo was CEO of number 1 Squadron. So somewhere, the wheels of bureaucracy churned, and they said, hey, let's tag Jumbo with his old friend who flew with him in Burma, and they sent him to 268 Squadron. And to say squadron, Man was a squadron leader, and Jumbo was there as a squadron leader attached to the squad. So there's this very nice group photograph of 268 Squadron in the European theater, where you have two squadron leaders in a group photo. Jumbo on one side, Man being the actual CEO of that squadron. So he arrived, I think, just after D-Day, and immediately within the subsequent week, he started flying missions in the Mustang that was being operated, the type that was being operated by 268. And he did his full tour of ops, a lot of the Falaise Gap, Ricky, and there are a couple of anecdotes where the missions that he was leading in were attacked by the Luftwaffe, that he was engaged in combat. Of course, he didn't have any opportunity to score any kills, but as a Ricky pilot, their job was to get the films and get out of there, not engage in heroics. So he did his full tour of operations with that squadron, and that's where that iconic photograph comes from. 268 started re-equipping with Typhoons, and Jumbo was trained on one of the Typhoons, and flew the Typhoon for a few weeks as well.
The Mustang 1 and 2, the Allison engine ones, great tactical reconnaissance aircraft. The FR Typhoon, not so much, shaking around as much as it was. The pictures got better as time went on. EK427, if anyone wants to look up one of Jumbo's Typhoons. There you go. There's a plane spotter one. I just find that role fascinating because they're slightly armed photo recon aircraft who are also tasked with, if there's a target of opportunity, have a go. But in that sort of airspace with that amount of flak, the images that they're bringing back, especially with those oblique cameras just behind the seats on the Mustangs as well, that they're just, when you look at them now, they're extraordinary photographs, and to get those to the commanders as quickly as possible was vital, and Jumbo's in the thick of it.
Yes, and it was that contribution that was again recognized when the bar for his Distinguished Flying Cross was gazetted. He was given a second award in the form of the bar, and he remains the only Indian Air Force pilot to ever have a DFC and bar. So, and that was a result of his contribution in the European theater.
I've just looked up on your website Jumbo's Citations, and the second one is, if you ever read Citations in the Gazette, by late 44, 45, they get shorter just because there's a lot of them. But his is actually quite long. I'll read it out because it's brilliant. This officer has completed many tactical reconnaissance and photographic sorties. His keenness for operational work and his skill on difficult and dangerous missions has always been outstanding. Before the advance northwards in France, he completed exceptionally valuable photographic reconnaissance of the sand bridges in the face of heavy ground defenses. He has also participated in long tactical reconnaissance on which he was several times intercepted by superior formations of enemy aircraft. His skill and courage have been outstanding. Remarkable tribute to Jumbo's skill.
And the sad part of it, you look at the date that the award was gazetted. 23rd January 1945. He did not live to receive the bar to the DFC. He died like 2 weeks later. Now I'll probably take a slight diversion here and speak about a personal tragedy that Jumbo had in his life. He spoke about his elder brother, Shackles. Right before he started off for Europe, his brother died in an aircraft crash.
Oh no.
That sort of weighed on him, but again, he didn't let that derail his plans. And when you realize ultimately when Jumbo also dies in 1945, both the sons lost their lives in the Second World War. That family lost both the brothers. It's really tragic from that point of view.
So when does he return to India, and what role is he given upon his return?
So after completing his tour towards Christmas of 1944 is when he arrives in India. He spends his Christmas with his family, and again, by now he's a bona fide war hero. Burma theater, European theater, DFC and bar. So the higher command decided to use him for publicity purposes. In fact, they tasked him with forming an IAF, Indian Air Force display flight. to form a flight that would go around the country, perform in air shows, perform displays, aerobatic routines, sort of motivate and encourage younger Indians to come and volunteer for the Indian Air Force. So he arrives in Peshawar towards the end of 1944 to raise this particular Indian Air Force display. He had to borrow pilots and aircraft from other squadrons like number 6 squadron, number 3 squadron, and form this nucleus of the display flight. And right from the word get-go, as they call it, it was something inauspicious start for the display flight. The first thing that happens is one of Jumbo's close friends, squadron leader Pritipal Singh, who was actually Jumbo's flight commander during the first Burma campaign. Both Jumbo and Pritipal go up to do some mock air combat over Peshawar. This was towards the end of December. For whatever reasons which we don't know, Pritipal flies into the ground. And he was one of those rare Cranwell trained, was one of the last Cranwell trained officers. That was shocking to Jumbo because they were engaging in mock combat, and there's this talk that they must have been taking risks to get behind each other, whatever it might be, must be taking unnecessary risk, whatever it might have been. But there's no denying the fact that it was in a mock air combat that Pritipal was lost. So that was the first setback. The display flight was found within a few days, and right on one of the inaugural days, I forget the date, but it was in January 1945. 2 of the pilots collide and die of the display flight. It wasn't a auspicious start, as they said. So still, with those setbacks, the display flight gets going. They started, they start planning, going around different cities in India performing. So they had Hawker Hurricanes. They had a couple of Tiger Moths, a couple of corner trainers. The trainers were used to give joyrides to civilians, and the Hurricanes were used for aerobatic displays. And that's how, Jumbo finds himself as the CEO of the display flight. And in February, he ends up coming to Lahore to perform during the sports day for a couple of training establishments there. That's the stage as to what was happening after he came back from Europe.
It's so tragic that these pilots who you would think go put on an air show for the civilians to drum up support would be a reasonably safe job, but he's already lost 3 pilots before they've even started getting going.
Yeah, but that was the story of the aviation in Second World War. I mean, if you look at the RAF casualties, 2/3 are probably in training. I'm talking about the fighter command. At least half to 2/3 would have been on non-operational reasons. Very few, only a small percentage would have been in actual air combat or due to enemy action. Same was the situation in Burma. The non-operational casualties were tremendous, mounting up to like 70 to 80%. But again, that's how the war went. So on February 17th, what happens on 17th again, exactly 8 years today, would be that Jumbo he finds himself in Lahore. And February 17th was also the birthday of his younger son. He had an older daughter, and it was his son's birthday. And he tells his son, I have this display flight. I'll come to your birthday party in the evening. I've got a gift for you and all. And he goes for the display flight. It happened roughly around 4 p.m. or 4:15 p.m. or so. In fact, there is a sports program that was published that lists out this is where the display is going to happen. And as for the documents or the accident card that exists, Jumbo started doing slow rolls as part of the display. He started doing slow rolls in the Hurricane. And he probably did 1 roll too many. I think he did a 3rd roll in which he lost the airspeed, and the aircraft stalled and went into an irrecoverable spin. And that's how his life was cut short. Such an experienced flyer, he had more than 2,000 hours by that time. Battle hardy veteran would make a mistake and lose his life. That's the sad part of it.
It makes me think a little bit of the F for Freddy mosquito crash in Calgary. two very experienced pilots just doing a little bit too much and it ending tragic, very tragic.
And we have seen this happen throughout the war. I mean, the first RAF is Copper Cane, came back from France, died doing slow rolls, beating up his own airfield. The American ace in the RAF, Lance Wade, same thing. He was beating up his airfield in his Spitfire. These are experienced ace pilots, but probably due to an element of overconfidence or not being in the right place, right time, had to pay with their lives.
So how old is Jumbo when he was killed?
When he died, he was born in 1913. So he was 32 years of age. If he hadn't died, he would have been one of the senior most officers for the Indian Air Force post-independence. He would have probably went on to become the air chief, or held the senior most spots in the AF. So yeah, very very bright career, cut pretty very short, and he was very respected as a combat leader. There's probably only one or two Indian pilots ever who flew operations in Europe after 1944, after D-Day. Jumbo was the only IF officer I know. There are a few Indians within the RAF who may have flown, but Jumbo is the only Indian Air Force commissioned officer who went from India to take part and gained that experience.
We started this when we're talking about him, saying about how well known he is now. His legacy has endured, and I guess he's very much held in high esteem with the modern IAF. How is he remembered today in India?
So there are only 3 to 4 names that have achieved this legendary status. One is Subrata Mukherjee, the first air chief, who was also the senior most, the first ever senior most Cranwell graduate. That is one. Then you have Air Commodore Meher Singh, again another Cranwell graduate from Second World War. Marshal Arjan Singh and Jumbo Majumdar. These 4 names are the only names that are considered as legends. And everybody in the Air Force, in the Indian Air Force today, they are aware of who these people are, who these personalities are. There used to be a Jumbo Majumdar trophy that used to be awarded at the IAF Flying College throughout the 60s and 70s. And in recent years, I don't know if you heard about the story about Jumbo's medals. So Jumbo had as I said, he did have children, a daughter and a son. And in fact, in 2015 or so, his son who has migrated to the UK decided to put up the medals for sale, and the Indian Air Force spent the money to acquire the medals from him, and now they are in display at Air Headquarters in New Delhi. So the Indian Air Force does value the legacy of Jumbo Majumdar so much that it took an unprecedented decision to spend its own money in a private business matter to acquire medals. That never happens. And I think that was an incredible thing that the Air Force had done to preserve Jumbo's legacy.
And I think that's a perfect way to start wrapping up. Jagan, that has been fantastic. Like I said, we're going to have you back to talk about the Indian Air Force more broadly, especially post-war independence and beyond. If only because it means we get to talk about Tempest for a bit, which I know we both quite like talking about.
Thank you very much for having me, Matt. This topic is something very close to my heart. Jumbo Majumdar, and you couldn't have picked a better topic to kick off this series about Indian aviators than Jumbo. So I'm very privileged to be part of your podcast and share my thoughts about Jumbo on this podcast. Thank you very much.
It's been an utter pleasure. Thank you so much. When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great